Awesome. So before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that this webinar is being held on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I just wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. And I'd also like to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and elders and people from other communities who may be joining us today. So my name is Madeline. I'm a Water Watch coordinator at Melbourne Water, and my role is to engage and build the capacity of communities to conserve and protect Melbourne's catchments. Some of you may be aware that last year Melbourne Water ran some in-person behaviour change workshops with BehaviourWorks Australia. And we found that these workshops were really well attended, and we received some great feedback from the community on their value. So we're really excited to be here today to deliver a digital version of those in-person workshops from last year. So today we have our expert facilitators again from BehaviourWorks Australia, based at Monash University, who will be providing an introduction to behaviour change techniques and how to apply them in your environmental projects. So we're lucky enough to have with us today Kavya Raj, who is a lecturer and education portfolio lead, and Melissa Hattie, who is a research fellow working across environment, education, and health portfolios. And I'll pass over to them. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Madeline. It's lovely to see all of you. Thank you so much for giving up an hour and a half of your day to come and learn all about behaviour change. We're very lucky to be able to do this work with Melbourne Water. We love talking about this particular topic, and we had a really great time doing the community workshops. Both Melissa and myself are very friendly, fairly informal presenters, and so we welcome all sorts of questions and comments as we're going along. I can already see that quite a few people have, posted thoughts in the chat. Please feel free to use the chat, not just to speak to us, but also to speak to each other as we're going along. There's also a Q&A if you want to really specifically articulate a question that you definitely want answered. And Melissa and I will do our absolute best to get through all those questions, either by writing a response or by explaining in real time. But if there's anything that we don't get answered today, we will do our best to come up with an answer and send it along to Madeline at the end of the session. So don't worry, your questions will still be answered. But please do feel free to, either in the Q&A or in the chat, post your ideas and comments, and we will, we'd love to hear from you. So what do we have in store for you today? Hopefully we've got a little bit of a comfortable but whirlwind tour of behavioural science, a bit of a 101 of what you need to know in the context of applying behavioural insights to water-specific challenges. Before we get into the content of the session, I thought it would be really nice to give you a little bit of an overview of who we are and what BehaviourWorks is. So we're part of Monash University, and we are, gosh, now, Melissa, please feel free to correct me if I get this wrong, because it's a jumble of words. We are Australia's largest university-based behaviour change research enterprise. I think that's the correct order.
Nicely worded.
I got there in the end. But essentially, we're a bunch of researchers who come from a whole host of different disciplines and backgrounds that are really interested in human behaviour. Why do people do what they do? And how can we create change? Those are the main things that we're really interested in. We come from different backgrounds like psychology and sociology and environmental science and behavioral economics, but really we bring all those disciplines together to use our best practice and our best research to help make effective change. So with all of that expertise and all of that very diverse background knowledge, we generally tend to think of changing behaviour in a very sort of systematic way. And that's part of the process that we're going to walk you through today. One of the things that we try our very best to do is to avoid making assumptions in behavioural science. There's often, the best laid plans and the best well-intentioned interventions or change programs don't always have the results that we'd hoped for. Oftentimes, just because there was a few assumptions baked in along the way. And so where possible, we try and avoid these to just boost our odds of success a bit. So we're going to take you through a couple of those assumptions that we want to try our best to avoid. We're then going to go through the next step in the process that we all tend to follow, which is defining behaviour. So it sounds really simple. We all sort of colloquially know what a behavior is. But there's very particular niche ways that behavioral scientists tend to frame or define a behavior. And we're going to give you a really nice, simple framework that you can use in your own work and your own challenges that really help, again, get you to the heart of the behavior that you're interested in, define it really clearly, and then you can design change programs, hopefully, a little bit more effectively. We're also going to walk you through something called behavior prioritization. Often we have a long list of things we want our audience to do, right? We've got lots and lots of behaviors that they could do to help improve the problem or solve the problem. And we don't always have the resources to get people to do lots and lots and lots of different things. And so it's really important for us to prioritize not only what we're asking others to do, but where we put our resources. So we'll share another really nice, simple example of how you could go about prioritizing in your own work. Then we're going to start bringing things to a close by my favorite bit, which is diagnosing barriers and enablers. And essentially what this means is, what do people find hard about doing our behaviors? And what do they find easy about doing the behavior? What things stop people from doing what we want them to do, and what things help them? We're going to use a nice, very simple model of behavior to do that. And then very lastly, we're going to give you a bit of a demonstration of how you might use all of this knowledge of what behavior is and what the barriers are, and how you might feed all of that information into building a solution or change program or an intervention. So that is what we have in store for you today. Let's get started with why we might want to avoid assumptions. So again, I want to sort of preface this by saying that all of us have made these assumptions at one point or another. It's very human to make these assumptions. And both Melissa and myself, at some point or another in our work, will have thought, oh, yeah, we know how to fix things. Let's just do this. So it is very normal. But we want to try and avoid assumptions because they reduce how likely we are to succeed in creating change. Fundamentally, that's the main reason. Just makes us less likely to be effective. In our work, one of the most common assumptions that we come across, particularly when we work with our partners, is that knowledge will change behavior. We see this time and time again in lots of examples. It's something that intuitively we think should work. If I just give people knowledge, if they just knew enough, then they do the right thing. Knowledge is important, but unfortunately, what the research tells us is that when we use knowledge in isolation, it's often insufficient to change behavior. It's not enough on its own. Now, a really common theory of change that we tend to see is, well, if people just knew enough, then they'd have a good attitude about what we want them to do. And if they had a good attitude about it, they'd intend to change their behavior. And if they have an intention, then of course they'll change their behavior. But we know from research that this doesn't really hold up. Intentions don't always lead to behavior, unfortunately. We've all been victim of that, right? Come Monday, I will work out at 5 p.m. I will go for a walk outside, and then we don't end up doing it, right? Intentions don't always lead to actions. And we also see that knowledge doesn't always change attitudes. Unfortunately, we can give people lots and lots of information, and it doesn't necessarily always change the way that they think or feel about doing a behavior. So this is a really common theory of change. I promise we see it a lot, but it is an assumption. There we go. Yeah, so intentions don't always lead to behavior, attitudes don't always lead to intentions, and knowledge does not always lead to attitude change. The second assumption that we tend to see is that we kind of assume people are like us, right? Oh, well, if someone told me the right thing to do and I really cared and I was passionate about it, then I would change my behavior. We are all in the minority, chances are. We've given up 90 minutes of our Friday to learn about behavioral science and how we can make more effective change. Chances are the people that we're working with and whose behavior we're trying to change are not like that. They're not our target audience. The third assumption that we tend to make is we use the same solution again and again and again, right? It's tempting if we think the only tool we have is a hammer, we treat everything as if it were a nail. But actually, we need to be quite varied in our approach. Just relying on information provision or just relying on one type of messaging or one type of solution tends not to be effective. And we see this, you don't have to read everything that's on the slide, but we see this time and time again. A good example is anti smoking campaigns. Over the past few decades, it's the combination of approaches that have been really effective in changing behavior. They didn't just rely on one strategy, they combined lots of strategies together, and that combination is what worked. So you want to try and you put as many eggs in different baskets as you can. So now that we know what assumptions we want to avoid, how exactly do we go about doing this through a behavioral approach? And we're going to walk you through very light touch how we're going to take you through this today. So at BehaviourWorks, at Monash, we use something called the BehaviourWorks method. It looks very complicated, but we've got a very simplified version of it for you that we're going to be taking you through. Broadly speaking, there's 4 main steps that you need to think about. The first is what's your problem and who's your audience? So what's the problem you're trying to solve and whose behavior do you want to change? Who is the person or the group of people that you are targeting? The second thing you want to think about is what behavior do they need to change? What do they need to do differently? The third, my favorite, is why are they not already doing it? What's currently driving their behavior? What's stopping them from changing their behavior? Is it attitudes? Is it knowledge? Is it other people? What are the things that make it hard? And then lastly, what's the solution? How can we use all this information to build an evidence-based solution? And these are the 4 steps that we're going to be walking through today. Now, I'm going to hand over to Melissa, who is going to take us through the behavior part because we've already sorted out your problem and your audience for you for the purpose of this webinar. So, Melissa, tell us about behavior.
Thanks, Kavya. So when we talk about behavior, we talk about something that we can see. If we can't, it's an observable event, if you want to take the technical term. And I apologize for the ableism in this statement for the vision impaired people. But if we can't see it, it's not a behavior. So these examples here, you can actually see someone driving a car. You can see someone putting bottles in a recycling bin. You can see someone talking on the phone. It's a really nice, simple, easy way. We often have clients come to us saying, oh, I just want people to care, or I just want people to know. Those kinds of things are what happens up here in our scones. You can't actually see these things happening. So what we want to think about when we're talking about behavior change is something that we can actually see. And one way we define this is with this ACT framework, which we'll go through in a second. It's who needs to do what, to what, where and when. And so we talk about, Kathy, if you can jump to the next one. So we talk about the audience, the actor. Who do we want to actually do the action? The action itself is the what. The target is what's being done to it. And so in the example with the bottles, for example, the actual action is putting the bottle and the target is the bottle or the bin. And so actually putting the bottle in the bin is what the action and the target is. The when and the where are the time and the context. So when a behavior happens is actually really important. If I ask someone to do a behavior at 3 a.m., it's going to be very different to doing that same behavior at 3 p.m. So when can be really important. The context is where is this going to happen? Equally, asking someone to do a behavior in their own backyard might be very different to doing that same behavior in a public space. And so the context and time actually can make a big difference around when our behavior actually happens. And so on the next slide, we have an example for you. We have used the example of responsible pet ownership throughout this webinar. And we'd like to now invite you to think, who is doing what, to what, where and when in this particular image? So the who might be the dog owner, the dog walker. The what is picking up the poo. The target is the actual poo itself. They're putting the bag down to actually pick up the dog poo. The context might be in the local dog park, and the time might be immediately after the dog has done its business. And so each of these elements, when we're describing the behaviour, help us to then develop an intervention most effectively because we target these specific elements of the behaviour that we want to actually change. And I think the next slide actually has this in more detail. So here we have here. So the dog owner is the audience, the action is the picking up, the target is the dog poo, the context is the public park, and the time is immediately after. And so when we think about time, we can think about it in terms of a time of day or a month or a season or relative to something else. So in this particular instance, the time is actually immediately after something has happened. And Kavya, I think I'll hand back to you.
So I know it sounds fairly complex. There's like, 5 moving parts in terms of what we think of as a behavior. But the main thing is, as Melissa was saying, if we change any of these bits, the behaviors become easier or harder to do, right? And that becomes really relevant when we get to diagnosing barriers. We want to be as specific as possible so that we can then be really accurate when we're coming up with reasons why people find it hard or easy to do. Now, a key part of behavioral science, as I mentioned, is prioritizing. We often have, as I said, a long list of possible behaviors that our audience could do, lots and lots of options that they could do to fix the problem. And we just don't really have the resources to tackle 5, 10, 15 behaviors, right? We often need to give people less options, mainly because also choice overload is a very real thing. If anyone's ever, turned on Netflix, looked at 20 different options and then just gone, oh God, I hate this, I'm turning off the TV. That's what happens when you have too many options to pick from. And same thing happens if we give people lots and lots of behaviors to pick from, right? We want to narrow it down. And so to demonstrate this, to give you a bit of a demo, show how this works in real life, Melissa and I have come up with a couple of behaviors, again, all around the theme of dog ownership, right? So let's say our particular challenge is we've got dog owners that are being a bit irresponsible. Their dogs are doing lots of different things. Some of the things that they're doing are damaging local waterways, or not being as positive in the community as they could be. And we might want them to do a lot of behaviors differently. And maybe some of the things we want them to do differently are, as Melissa said, picking up their dog poo from the park, keeping their dogs on leash in on-lead areas all the time, not letting them run down the riverbank or along the beach where it's an on-lead area. We might also want owners to register their dogs with the council. We might want them to update their dog's microchip every time they change address. And we also might want to ensure that their dog wears a collar with an ID tag containing their contact details at all times. Now, again, I know you've just learned this framework of who does what to what, when and where, and it takes time. Our students in our master's degree take a good 6 to 7 weeks to get this framework down pat. But hopefully you can see that every single one of these 5 behaviors has an audience, which is our dog owner. There's a clear action, there's a verb, a thing that they're doing. And then there's a clear time and context. There's a clear time of day and there's a clear location or context for this. Now, how exactly do we go about deciding which of these 5 or even more options we choose to focus our efforts on, right? Where are we going to get most bang for our buck? Well, we tend to use something, it's a really nice prioritization tool, and it's called the Impact Likelihood Matrix. As the name suggests, it considers 2 things, impact and likelihood. And the main reason, as I was mentioning, that we use this tool is because it allows us to avoid choice overload. It allows us to stop ourselves from giving people dozens of options that just makes them feel really overwhelmed and panicked. It allows us to decide where we should allocate our resources. If we're a community group and we're trying to figure out where to focus our efforts, applying a prioritization tool can be incredibly helpful. And then, as I said, it also allows us to think about all the reasons that people aren't doing what we want them to do in a much more detailed way. It allows us to go into much more depth. So, what would this look like in practice if I was to apply this kind of prioritization tool, right? Well, we're going to start with impact. So, impact essentially means the extent to which my behavior would address the problem. The best way that I find to think about this is, imagine I gave you a magic wand, and by having that magic wand, you could make absolutely everyone do this behavior. Everyone that you want to focus on will do this behavior. All dog owners are going to do what I want them to do. If every single dog owner in my area did this behavior, would it reduce the problem of irresponsible dog ownership? Right? That's the question you want to ask, is if absolutely everybody did this, would it reduce my problem or change my problem? So impact, just think magic wand. Now, step 2 is likelihood. And this is sadly where the magic wand gets taken away. We are back in the real world. Likelihood is the extent to which our behavior is actually likely to be adopted by our audience. So this is when we're asking ourselves, is anyone actually going to do this? Right? Is 50% of my audience going to do this? Or is it only 20% of dog owners that are actually going to do this, right? There's a couple of ways you can ask yourself about about likelihood. You might consider how effortful your behavior is. Really hard, complex behaviors that require a lot of effort are just less likely to do, right? People don't want to do things that are complex and hard. We might also think about history. Have they done things like this before? So do we know that dog owners have previously done these things that we're interested in? Or we can look at something called intention. Do we know by speaking to dog owners that they intend to do what we want them to do? Now, obviously, you ask yourself the same question, regardless of the problem. We're just using dog owners as the continuing case study, but the process remains the same. So this is a couple of ways that you can think about likelihood. Now, we want to demo how you would go about actually applying this tool. So there's a couple of steps to applying the impact likelihood matrix. The first thing that you want to do is that for every single behavior that you have, you want to score them from 1 to 5 on impact and on likelihood. So you're essentially going through your list of behaviors and you're saying, okay, for every single one of these, from 1 to 5, how impactful would it be on the problem? And then from 1 to 5, how likely is it that people will really do this? And you give each one a score. And you can give them the same score. It's not like you have to rank them. You're just scoring it from 1 to 5. 1 is very low, so it's not very impactful and it's not very likely. And 5 is very high. It's very impactful or it's very likely. So let me show you what this looks like in real life. So for every single one of these 5 behaviors that I walked you through, picking up dog poo, keeping dogs on lead, registering their dog with the council, and so on, Melissa and I have come up with some fake scores, but some scores nonetheless, for every single behavior on both impact and on likelihood. So you can see for the first behavior, we've said, if every single dog owner picked up their dog poo, every single dog owner in our community, that would be pretty impactful upon the problem of responsible ownership. We'll give it a 4. How likely do we think this is? You know what? Most people in the area that we're looking at are already very responsible owners. They already do this. So it's fairly likely to happen. We'll also give it a 4. If we look at the behavior, though, of updating their dog's microchip registry every time they change address, would this really impact the problem of responsible ownership? Maybe not so much. Impact is a bit lower. It's a 2. How likely do we think people are to actually remember every single time they move house to change their dog's microchip? Also pretty low. We're very forgetful creatures. So we'll score that a 2. Right? So it's the same process for every behavior. You go through and you score them 1 by 1 by 1 on impact and on likelihood. Once you have all of these scores and you've scored all behaviours on the two components of impact and likelihood, you can do the second step, which is plotting. And this is where you're not doing anything fancy. It looks fancy, but I promise it's not. It just helps us visualize our behaviours. What you do is you take every score you've generated for your behaviour and you plot it onto this matrix, right? And again, matrix sounds fancy. It's 2 lines. So the vertical line up and down is on impact. So 5 all the way at the top, 3 in the middle, and 1 at the bottom. Vertical line, impact. Then we've got the horizontal line, which is likelihood. So again, 5 all the way at this end, 3 in the middle, and 1 at the end. It forms a nice square. And you just start moving these behaviours into their correct spot. So let's have a look at behaviour 2. I gave it an impact score of 4. So on my vertical line, I go all the way up to spot number 4. But the likelihood is 3. Oh, sorry, I've popped that in the wrong. It should say likelihood of 2. That is my bad. Likelihood of 2. Imagine it says likelihood of 2 and it goes across to this side, right? What it looks like, there we go, that's correct. What it looks like when you have all your behaviours plotted, this has worked out very nicely. Behaviours don't normally look this very pretty and perfectly placed, but you will start to see that your behaviours end up in slightly different squares. Maybe you got lots and lots of behaviours up here. Maybe you've got lots of behaviours over here. They might look very pretty and even like ours, who knows? But it just helps you visualize the different places of your behavior. Now, the reason that we try and visualize this is because we want to use it to help us pick a single behavior. And we do it by this. Anything that's in this top right square is a behavior that's gotten a really high score on impact and a really high score on likelihood. So what we're saying is any behavior up here, it's going to really make a dent in our problem. And excitingly, lots of people are likely to do it. This is gold, right? We love to find behaviors here. Then in this square, what we've got is behaviors that got a really high score on impact, right? So they've still gotten a 3 or a 4 or a 5 on impact, but they're not very likely to happen. So behaviors up here, maybe they're harder behaviors or they're more complex. They might be more costly, time consuming. We don't know, but they tend to be less likely to occur. Down here, we've got behaviors that aren't very impactful, right? They're like a 2 or a 1 on impact. So they're not really moving the dial that much on the problem, but lots of people are likely to do it. And that's pretty interesting. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. And then down here, we ignore. We don't want to go here. This low priority. And so when you've got behaviors up in this top right quadrant, this top right square that are really impactful, really likely, that should be your first priority. If as a team, as a community group, if you're trying to decide what should we try and get people to do differently, do this scoring, have a go at doing it. And if you get any behaviors that fall in here, that should be your first priority. The reason that we encourage doing this impact likelihood process is it steers us away from gut feel where we think, this will be an awesome behavior. And it actually gets us to check our own assumptions and think, whoa, is that really correct? Have I picked the right behavior? Is it actually going to shift the needle on the problem? If you've got behaviors up in this square that are very impactful but not very likely to happen, you can still focus on them if as a group or as a team you've got the resources to increase likelihood. So often behaviors end up here, like I said, because they're costly or time consuming or hard. And so you might need to find ways as a group to make your behavior easier to do. How can you make it as easy and accessible as possible? How can you try and reduce the barriers? That tends to increase likelihood. So you absolutely can go here if you feel that you have the resources to do it. Down here, where I said it's not really changing much on the problem. It's the impact is low, but it's very likely. I like to think of this as like getting my foot in the door, right? It's getting people to change something that's really easy, not that hard. And hopefully you get something called spillover, which is when they do something really simple. And then over time they go, oh, yeah, maybe I'll do this other behavior. It's a bit more complex. And then maybe I'll do this other behavior. And then I'll do this other behavior. And you get people doing more environmentally conscious things over time because you started with something really easy. Like I said, anything down here, avoid, 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 avoid. Yes, and then as Melissa said, one of the challenges with behaviors up here, a lot of people tend to already be doing this. So you will find that even if you do have behaviors here, because lots of people are doing them already, you tend to end up going up here or down here anyway. And so when we look at all the behaviors that we had, identified and scored around responsible ownership, we can see that we've got a behavior up here, behavior here. Like we've got one in each quadrant and one in the middle. Because we've got one in this very impactful, very likely square, that's our first priority. And so that's where we're going to go. And so we're focusing on dog owners picking up dog poo from the public park immediately after the dog has pooed, right? So this is just a hypothetical demo, but you can see how by going through all the possible options, figuring out what level of impact and likelihood they have, it just gives you a visual way and a more reasoned way rather than gut feel to make a decision. So we've identified all our behaviors. We've picked one behavior. How do we take this now to the next step forward? And Melissa is going to walk us through this.
So one of the theories there are a lot of different theories of behavior and how we go about changing behavior, but one of the nicest, simplest, easiest ones that we use is one that's called COM-B. There's a research team in the UK led by Susan Mickey, and they came up with this in 2011, tied to a thing called the behaviour change wheel, which we'll come to in a moment. But the basic idea behind this is for a behaviour to happen, someone needs to have capability, they need to have opportunity, and they need to have motivation. And there's different elements within each of these that I will step you through now. So capability can be psychological capability or it can be physical capability. Now, psychological capability might be something like knowledge. Do they know how to do something? Do they have the memory capacity to be able to do it? Are they paying attention to it? Do they have the decision-making skills? So if someone doesn't know how to do a behavior, they're probably not going to do it. Physical capability might be something like strength, endurance, dexterity, physical skills. So if we're asking someone to do a behavior that involves some complex physical movement, do they actually have the strength or the physical capacity to be able to do that? The next one is motivation. Now, two different types of motivation, reflective motivation and automatic motivation. Now, reflective motivation is things like goals, plans, beliefs about consequences. So if I think a behavior is a good thing to do, if I think doing a behavior is actually going to have a positive consequence, I'm actually more likely to do it. If I think something's not worth doing, it's not worthwhile, I have that belief that it's not a good thing, I'm probably less likely to do it. Automatic motivation we can think of as something that happens a bit in the kind of subconscious awareness. So it's things like emotions, heuristics, those kind of mental shortcuts that we take to do things, or habits. A lot of our behaviors happen quite habitually without even thinking of them. A lot of people will brush their teeth in the morning without thinking, and that's kind of driven by this automatic motivation. The final one is opportunity. Now, opportunity is both social, but there's also physical opportunity. Now, a social opportunity is other people. We humans are very responsive to what other people do. We often think we're not influenced by other people, but we absolutely are. And so if someone else is doing a behavior, I'm more likely to do the behavior. Similarly, if someone thinks a behavior is the right thing to do, then I'm more likely to do that behavior. And we can use these when we're actually developing interventions, which we'll get onto later on. But it might also be social cues, or it might be cultural norms. So different cultural groups in the world will actually do things for different reasons based on what their particular cultural norms might be. Physical opportunity are things like, do I have the physical cues? Do I have a reminder? Am I in the right location? Do I have the resources? So do I have the time to do something? Do I have the financial resources? Do I have whatever kind of other material resources, that kind of physical opportunity in order to do the actual behavior? And we can very broadly group these into internal influences, so the things that kind of happen internal to us. And that's things like psychological capability, our physical strength, physical capability, motivation, both of the motivation, reflective and automatic emotions are kind of an internal experience. Whereas opportunity happens outside of us. There's something that happens in the actual environment around us. And this can have implications on how we actually develop interventions later on. Now we've got a little activity for you here now. I'm just going to set this up.
So for those of you who have their phone handy while Melissa's getting this set up, all you need to do is open up the camera on your phone and hold it over the QR code. And you should get a little quiz that pops up. Or if you're struggling with the QR code, you can also enter the URL, which is polev.com/BWA.
If it asks you to register, just skip past the registration part. You don't need to do any of that. It's all set up completely anonymously. And you'll find that there are 6 questions on this survey. And it's just a little bit of a quiz to get your brains thinking. You can work through it at your own pace to work out which of these examples are actually which element of COM-B.
I'll leave it up for just a little bit longer before I go across to the questions. If anyone's having trouble with the QR code, please feel free to chuck it in the chat. But if we're all ready, I might go across to the questions. Sound good, Melissa?
Yeah, great. Looks like most of you have found your way into the survey, which is good.
Okay, so we've got 6 questions. And what we want you to try and do is think about for each question, which of the 6 components of COM-B, and Melissa's given you the explanation, which component do you think it matches to? And I'll give you some gentle thinking music. Alrighty, we're getting steadily close to finishing.
We've got 15 completes, so we're still going.
Alrighty, I'll give you another 30 seconds and then we will move along to answers. Alrighty. Shall I pull us back in?
Jump across. We're about 30 surveys completed, so good enough.
Amazing. Okay. Don't worry if you're still finishing the last few questions. I just want to walk you through what the answers are and why those answers are the way that they are. So, the very first question, a new dog owner doesn't know how to register their dog with the local council. Now, luckily for this one, the main clue is actually in the barrier itself. They don't know how, right? It's a lack of knowledge, which means that the main component that's missing is psychological capability. And so, a way that we might solve this problem, we might think about solving this barrier, is by giving the dog owner clear instructions or practical knowledge on how to register their dog. You'll start to see as I keep going that for every barrier, the barrier itself basically tells you what you need to do in your solutions, just the other side of the same coin, right? If someone doesn't know what to do, then the way that we get rid of that is just by telling them what to do. We give them the knowledge, right? So this is the nice thing about barriers and solutions. The next one, a dog owner doesn't have poo bags with them when they're on a walk and they can't find any nearby. I think we've all been in this position at some point or another, and there's like immediate panic that fills all of us. Now, importantly, the thing here is it's not like it's saying they don't care or they don't know they need to have bags or they don't believe it's important. It's just that they physically, genuinely don't have any on them, and they also physically cannot find any in their environment, which means that the thing that's missing is physical opportunity. They need to be able to carry this physical resource with them, or they need to walk in an area where bags are already provided by the council. So if the owner doesn't have bags, one way, if maybe they can't remember to buy them or they're not able to afford them, one way is to get dog owners to walk in parks where they're already provided. The third barrier is about a dog being a giant breed and the dog walker not being strong enough to restrain them. This is a physical strength issue. So it's physical capability. They need more strength. Now, we can't necessarily tell people to start working out a ton just to be strong enough to walk their dog. But something that we can do is recommend that they place a head collar on the dog, a halty collar, to reduce the strength that's required to walk the dog safely, right? So we can encourage that they change the things that they're using that then place less emphasis on their physical strength. The fourth one, a dog owner doesn't believe it's important to pick up after their dog in the local dog park, right? We come across this a fair bit. Oh, it's not that big of a deal. What's the harm? I don't really think it's that important. This is all attitudinal, right? Their attitudes are saying that they don't believe it's important to do, which is a motivation issue. And it's reflective motivation because it's slow. They're thinking about it. It's a bit more conscious, right? So because the dog owner has a negative attitude towards picking up poo, because they don't see the relevance or the benefit, I forgot to add this, but a solution that we could do is showcase the effects that not picking up after their dog has on the broader environment. So we could emphasize the consequences to try and change their attitude. The fifth one, the owner feeling disgusted, that sort of ick factor or yuck factor. Disgust is an emotion. It's very instinctive and automatic. And so it's automatic motivation. They're driven by an automatic response without conscious thought. And so there's a few solutions that we will share in just a moment of what they could do. Lastly, they see most dog owners walking their dogs off lead. This is a social opportunity barrier. They're influenced to do the same thing as other people. And so a way that we could intervene is by changing the social norms, changing what they're seeing all the time. And so we're going to go through this in a little bit more depth. So we understand COM-B now, right? We're thinking about our enablers and barriers. We're thinking about why people find this really hard to do. What are the things that prevent them? If we had gone through in a lot more depth, we might get a long laundry list of barriers. And so for capability, we might have lots of people saying, I don't know how to do this. I don't know why I need to do it. I find the decision making hard. I don't have the physical skills. I can't sustain it, right? All these capability problems. There we go. My animations are doing something very interesting on a Friday. Around motivation, we might have people saying, I don't believe it's a good thing for me to do. I don't plan on doing this. It doesn't align with who I am as a person, my values and my identity. Or they might be saying things like, well, it's just not a habit for me to do what you are asking of me. Or I feel, disgusted, or I feel sad, or I feel angry when I have to do this. Some negative emotions. And lastly, you might have a lot of barriers around opportunities. They might say, oh, well, my friends and my family don't do this. So, why should I? I don't do it because they don't do it. Or it's not culturally normal for me to do this. Or a really common one is when I'm out and about, I'm not seeing other people doing this. We're so influenced by social norms. We're so inclined to perform what other people are doing. Or you might have people say, my environment doesn't support me to do this. I don't have the access or the resources. I don't have the time or the money. So you might start, as you unpack your behavior, whatever it is that you're interested in, whether it's people attending, community workshops or waterway cleanups or participating in working bees or, doing responsible ownership behaviors or planting certain behaviors. You you might find that as you really start unpacking it, there's lots and lots of reasons across these 6 areas that make it hard for people to do what you want them to do. Now, I think I've got a question in the chat. Melinda, very informative. You might discuss this later, so sorry if I'm jumping the gun. I'm curious about your take on the audience and the importance of segmenting them to help improve your prospect of changing behaviors, i.e., the ones you believe will be early adopters versus late majority or the laggards. Importance of doing this work and securing advocates ahead of time. What a beautiful question. You're not jumping the gun at all, Melinda. It was something that we talked about in the larger workshops, but for the purpose of the webinar, we cut down on. But Melissa, you tend to do a little bit more work in segmentation than I do. Would you like to speak to this one?
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. Segmenting and understanding your audience is really important because different people do behaviors or don't do behaviors for all sorts of reasons. And segmentation is a way of understanding why person A might do it compared to person B. And so actually first understanding who your audience is and why they're doing or not doing it is really, really important because the drivers and the barriers can actually differ depending on the audience. And we sometimes find too that different characteristics of an individual person might actually influence why they do or don't do a behavior. So for example, an older person might do a behavior for a different reason to a younger person, or a male to a female, or someone who lives in the city versus someone that lives in the country. So understanding who these audiences are absolutely will actually then influence the rest of this process in terms of working out what the drivers and barriers of that behavior are. Great question.
Really good question. And we see this in our work a lot. We tend to segment down quite a fair bit because often what we want one segment to do, what behavior we want them to do, is actually different to another segment. You might already have adopters and non-adopters, people that are complying and not complying. So you want different behaviors from different groups of people. And as Melissa said, this becomes very different across those segments. And then the way that you solve the problem, the way that you intervene becomes really different. So that's why these are the 4 main steps. And the most important one at the beginning is selecting the right audience. So very good question. And we can give more resources on that if you want. But coming back to barriers. So once you know your segment, what audience you're actually focusing on, you know what you want them to do, and you start figuring out why they're not already doing it, you might have this very, very long list of all these. And this is, to be honest, this is a short list. The list can be much, much, much longer. But let's give you a demonstration coming back to our dog ownership behavior. What are the barriers and how do they fit under these different bits of COM-B, right? So when we think about capability, We might have owners saying, well, I don't know why I'm meant to pick up after my dog. Like, what's the reason? I don't have the knowledge. Physical capability might be a real issue, right? They might say they've got a back injury and they can't physically get down to pick up after their dog. They might believe that it's not an important thing to do. So this is an attitude, right? An attitude is a belief about something. I don't believe it's that serious. I don't believe that it's an important thing for my community or the environment. The disgust factor, that ick, that emotion, that's very automatic motivation. Social opportunity, this is a big one in certain areas, right? Like if lots and lots and lots of people in your community are doing the wrong thing, you sort of get a bit of a free pass to keep doing the wrong thing. And so social opportunity could be a real barrier. No one else is doing it, so why do I have to? And then that physical opportunity. Maybe I really want to. I know that I need to. I care. I think it's important, but I physically don't have the bag on me and I can't find one. So that's an opportunity issue. Now, how do we go from all of those different things to an actual intervention? Now, by intervention, we just mean a change solution, right? A way that we create change. An intervention could be a campaign or a program or something like that. But that's what an intervention is. It's just the way that we make change happen. So
behavior change solution.
Behavior change solution. Thank you. So how do we go about doing this?
So we've gone through this process of stepping you through the different types of barriers and drivers because that's what we then map the intervention onto. I mentioned earlier, Susan Mickey's team developed a behaviour change wheel, and we've got an image of that on the next slide. And what this was basically done is you can see in the middle, in the green section, you've got your capability, your opportunity, and your motivation. And then in the red on the outside of that, you've actually got different, what they call intervention functions. And what this is different types of barriers actually lend themselves to different types of interventions. And so this wheel was a way of kind of matching these things up so that you could then say, okay, well, I've got this particular barrier. This is my particular intervention. If you're dealing this particular image, you can see the grey around the outside. This is more kind of on a macro scale. So if we're talking about bigger level things like policy type things at the government level, that's kind of where we get into that grey section. But for today, we'll just focus on the red and the green. And so what exactly do we mean by intervention functions? Well, these are basic kind of broad categories that we can use to develop interventions to actually change behaviour. Remember, Kavya said in the beginning that if we think everything is a nail, or if we think we've only got a hammer, we're going to treat everything as if it were a nail. And what this is basically showing is not everything is a hammer and a nail. We actually have a lot more at our disposal than we think we do. And so education, fairly self-explanatory. We're basically increasing knowledge or understanding. We're just kind of giving people information. Do we have the example next, Kavya, or is it the persuasion?
It's all of the definitions.
All of the definitions. Okay, so the next one is persuasion. This is about we're inducing particular positive or negative feelings. So we're trying to change attitudes or we're trying to trigger an action through our communication. So we can frame words in such a way that they're quite persuasive. You've often kind of seen the persuasive ad campaigns. If anyone lived through the 80s, remember the Grim Reaper that we had around the AIDS campaign, that was very persuasive. Incentivization is exactly as it sounds. It's creating that expectation of a reward. And so we often think of incentives as money. So if you get a financial benefit, but incentives don't actually have to be money. They can actually be things like praise or recognition or some kind of status, so we can use incentives in lots of different ways. Modeling is providing examples of other people doing it. And so we can often use influential people, we can use people that are perhaps quite high status in the community. We tend to listen to people that are like us, and we tend to listen to people that have a kind of a status. And so I was in a workshop late last night, and someone said that they had someone come to this workshop that was dressed in these robes. It was actually the mayor, but it was at a primary school, and the primary school kids thought it was the Queen. And so this was particularly influential because they thought, oh, the Queen's come to our school. And so we could use this as a way of kind of modeling the ideal behavior that we want people to do. Training is slightly different to education. Training is actually imparting skills. So education is imparting knowledge. Training is actually skills, and often that involves the kind of the doing part. Enablement is a bit of a catch-all. It's a bit way of how can we kind of make something easier. And so it might mean giving people the means, or it might be reducing barriers to actually increase the capability or the opportunity for someone to actually do a behavior. Environmental restructuring is on that outside physical context. How can we actually change that physical environment around us, whether that's the social environment or whether that's the actual physical kind of environment, to make the behavior more likely to happen? Coercion is kind of, the flip side of incentivize. It's creating that expectation of a punishment or a cost. And again, it doesn't have to be financial. People will often avoid doing a behavior or change their behavior if it brings up a negative emotion, maybe shame or embarrassment. And restriction is all about making it, creating rules or changing the kind of opportunity to make the alternative behavior, the one that you don't want them to do, harder to do. And so an example of this is with the no smoking campaigns, where they created areas where you couldn't smoke. And so they were restricting it and saying, okay, you can't smoke here, but you can smoke there. And so the rules were there in place to change people's behavior about where they actually were able to smoke. And I'll give you some examples here now in the context of our dog example and our responsible pet ownership. And so education might be providing information, providing leaflets to dog owners about where they can take their dog to an off-lead park. If the problem is people have got their dog off-lead in places where they should be on-lead, provide them with education, with information about where they can actually take the dog. Persuasive communication in the context of our dog poo example might be, you might show videos or images of children standing in dog poo and kind of going, oh, this is awful. And this would then potentially persuade people to say, oh, well, we don't want kids stepping in dog poo. That's a bit gross and unhygienic, so we'll pick up the dog poo. It's a persuasive kind of message that kind of uses that negative emotion. Incentivization, creating that expectation of a reward. So you might, for example, provide free dog obedience classes for new dog owners. You're giving that incentive. So if they're actually registering their dog, if you're wanting to encourage a particular behavior, the reward might be the free dog obedience class. Modeling. We want to show the behavior actually happening. We might want to show images or videos of influential people actually doing the behavior that we want them to do. And so it might be someone influential in the community that's got a dog actually picking up their dog's poo. Training is you might develop a game to actually get people to kind of practice how to do something. We often see this, we actually modeled this in the workshops that we did late last year, in that because we had people actually actively doing activities during the workshop, give them information and then they practiced. And so that was training. They were actually getting that set of skills being developed. An example of enablement, we're basically trying to increase the means or reduce the barriers for something to happen. And so you might provide dog poo bags at the entrance or the exit of a local park. And so this is just making it that little bit easier for dog owners to actually pick up their poo. Environmental restructuring. Environmental restructuring might be something like installing a fence around a fragile ecosystem. And so where I used to live in Coburg, there was an area that was kind of a nature revegetation place, and a lot of dog owners would have their dogs running off lead in this space. And so installing a fence around that area changes the environment, changes how that environment exists, puts that restructuring in place so that dogs actually physically can't get into that reveg area. Coercion, in terms of a punishment or a cost. This happens certainly in my council and I think everywhere else. Registration fees for aggressive breed dogs or dogs that are intact or unneutered are often more expensive. And so this is an incentive to get people to either not have aggressive breed dogs this is a coercive way, punishment or cost, to then get their dogs desexed. And finally, restricting. You might reduce the rules for the maximum, introduce rules so that the maximum number of dogs that you can keep on a particular property. This certainly exists in my council. We can't have more than, I think it's 2 dogs, depending on the property size. But that's creating that that restriction of what you actually can physically or not do with your dog. And so we can actually map this onto a matrix to make it a little bit easier for us to work out. We've got our particular barrier and we've got what we want to try to address. What interventions could we actually do to try to address these? And so if the issue is a psychological capability issue, so for example, someone doesn't know how to do something, we could provide them with education. We could provide them with training. We could provide them with enablement. We could make it a little bit easier for them to do this particular behaviour. If we jump down to physical opportunity, for example, we might be able to train them on how to do something. Again, we could enable them. We could provide a situation to make it that little bit easier. We might change the physical environment to make it a little bit easier for them, or we might restrict the behaviour that we don't want them to do to encourage the behaviour that we do want them to do. And so, as you can kind of see by this matrix, we wouldn't try to do environmental restructuring if the problem is a physical capability, because it doesn't make sense to change the environment if the problem is I don't have the physical strength or the stamina or the endurance. It just doesn't match up. And we often see in behaviour change campaigns, people probably sometimes actually put information out there with education when the problem actually is not needing information, it's actually needing something else. And so a lot of government campaigns, for example, will often say, if only people knew, they put out information, but the information alone may not necessarily address the barrier.
We've actually got a really good question before we move on, Melissa,
Yeah.
from Rob, which is, recently there's been some concern expressed about the environmental effects of the systemic spot-ons that we treat dogs with. I'm guessing like the spot dog treatments.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is massive corporate pressure to use these products. Would this be too complex of an issue to address with these tools?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. So there feels like there's a few different barriers at play here. So I feel like that there would be different interventions depending on which barrier you wanted to address. And so if the problem was an attitude, so say it was around, I don't think it's the right thing to do, then that would potentially be a different intervention than if it was, what's the other option? Massive corporate pressure. Again, well, yeah, again, if you've got that environment, the pressure coming from outside, whether it's the social environment or whether it's, you know, the policy kind of context, again, the intervention could potentially be quite different. So it feels like there's quite a few barriers at play here. In this one issue. And yes, it is quite a complex issue. But again, the behavior that you're trying to encourage is that for people to use the spot-ons or to not use the spot-ons, because again, that would influence how you then address the particular behavior change.
Yeah, it's a really good one, hey? Like we've got a really clear understanding of the problem behavior, which it sounds like is using the spot-ons. And so the positive behavior that you'd want people to do something different, like you'd want them to use a different kind of treatment. So firstly, you'd go through the same 4 steps, which is like understanding your problem and then thinking about whose behavior needs to change. Is it dog owners that are currently using these treatments? What behavior do you want them to do instead? So use a different type of treatment. What are the reasons that they don't use that different kind of treatment? Is it that it's more expensive or it's harder to use or that they feel like it's not as effective? Maybe they've got some attitudes about it. Maybe they have a partner or a family that buys the spot-on treatments and this is a bit of social pressure there. So you go through this process and then, as Melissa said, you'd have different interventions, these different vertical options, depending on which of these 6 are most important for you to change. But no reason why you wouldn't be able to go through the same process. It's really just that last bit about the massive corporate pressure. That's sort of, as Melissa said, stepping into that systems level. And obviously behaviors happen inside systems. They don't happen in a vacuum. But you do sometimes need a behavioral intervention that's focused on individual people, combined with a bit of a system solution that's maybe introducing regulation or changing policy, or a bit more media of approach. And that's more at that macro systems level, right? Rather than the lower down individual level. You kind of sometimes need them to happen together. So you need the individual intervention to focus on the dog owners, and then maybe you need a bit of systems change to deal with that corporate pressure, and they work together. But it's a really good question. But Melissa, oh wait, hang on, actually, I think this is me, sorry.
This is you, you've got the
This
mic.
is me. So I want to give you a bit of a demo about how we can use functions to make change. So we've got our behavior, we've got our audience, dog owners. We know what we want them to do. We want them to pick up after their dogs. We've already identified all the reasons that they're not doing it. We've got a long list of barriers. How do we move from those barriers to these intervention functions and solutions? So if we think about capability, we had two barriers there, right? They didn't know that they were meant to do this, and they've got a bit of an injury. So when we think about how we fix this, what are some things we could do? Well, if they don't know that they're meant to do it, we can educate them. That's the most straightforward one. If someone doesn't know something, you educate. We can also add in a little bit of persuasion to really make that information a bit more sticky, make it really, make them pay attention, make them care. And so we can provide informative posters that have this persuasive visual imagery that explain the environmental harm caused by leaving dog poo uncleaned, and the harm that it has on the environment and local wildlife as it disintegrates, right? So this is one way that you can go from the barrier to your intervention options, and then to a bit more of a tangible idea. If someone's got a back injury and they can't physically do the behavior, well, we could enable them, and we could enable by providing long-handed dog poo shovels at the entrance to public dog parks. So enablement is one way that we can increase capability. Technically, there's a little bit of restructuring in there because you're adding something into the environment with the shovels, but it's mainly enablement, right? You're making the behavior physically easier for people to do by giving them these shovels. So they don't have to bend, they can stay upright. Then we've got some motivation barriers, right? So firstly was an attitude one. Oh, I just don't believe it's important. Well, how do we change people's attitudes? One way is that we can persuade them. And how could we persuade them? Again, we could use imagery, right? We could provide imagery of lots and lots of dog poo on the ground in a public park and people standing on it. We're trying to elicit those emotions of ew, disgust, to get people to change their attitude and get people to do what we want them to do. Automatic motivation, that automatic emotional response of I feel disgusted. Well, if it's the physical act of picking up the poo with the bag that makes them disgusted, how can we get them to do it in a way that just isn't that physical action? And again, the same solution of the long-handed shovels comes back in, because if you're using the shovel, you're not touching it. You've brought in a bit of enablement to change that automatic motivation issue. Lastly, with some opportunity problems, so if I don't see anyone else in the park doing it, the most straightforward way to solve the issue of not seeing others do it is by showing others do it. It's modeling. So you start showing other owners picking up after their dog on posters, in campaign videos. You show them social examples that they can then imitate and copy. And then if it's a physical resource problem, right, they don't have the bags, again, we can enable and change the environment by providing free bags, by incorporating this into the environment. So this is when we might get councils to provide free bags to all dog owners, let's say when they register their dog with the council. Or we might get councils to provide free bags at dog parks, so then everybody has access to the resource. As I mentioned, we've got the same solution happening twice. This is really common. You can absolutely use the same solution to tackle barriers that sit in different domains, right? If we come back to this, and we've got someone who is saying, that they have a negative attitude and they don't know what to do, well, we can educate to tackle both of them, right? Or if someone says, I'm not skilled enough and I don't know how to do it, well, training tackles both of them, right? So you can absolutely use the same intervention option, the same solution to get at multiple barriers. And what this means is you just get more bang for your buck, right? Like you're doing the same idea, it's covering multiple problems, multiple barriers. It means that it's less resource intensive for you, it's often less costly, less time consuming, and it's still addressing multiple barriers that your audience is facing. And so this is a really nice way to do that. Before we move on, any questions at this point? Because actually, if I'm right in thinking, we're getting close to summary and wrap up. So before we do summary and wrap up, we might pause for a bit of Q&A. So what I will do is open up the chat and I'll open up the Q&A box as well. And this is the chance to pepper us with any and all questions. I'll give you a couple of minutes if you're in the midst of typing. Maybe we've done a great job and there are no questions. Maybe we've just explained things really well, Melissa.
Oh, we've explained questions answered questions along the way. So.
Oh, good. Oh, no, we've got questions. Any advice on evaluations? Oh, Catherine, you're speaking my language. Any advice on evaluations and making changes if the interventions aren't giving the results we expect? What a great question. So yes, I do have advice. So I'm trying to think of the simplest way to explain it. So generally speaking, there's a couple of things that you want to measure as you're going along, exactly so that you can make changes to your intervention if you're not getting the results that you want. So the first thing you want to do is, I'm going to come to this slide because I think it will help showcase it. So you want to have some kind of way of measuring your behavior, right? Are people actually doing the thing that you want them to do? You want to measure if you're changing the barriers. So are you increasing knowledge? Are you changing attitudes? Are you shifting social norms? Are you increasing opportunity? Because what that tells you is you've designed this beautiful, wonderful, creative solution, but maybe your solution is not making your behavior happen. Or maybe your solution is changing attitudes and knowledge and all these things, but your behavior still isn't happening. And what that tells you is, okay, my intervention's great. People like it. They want to participate. It's changing some barriers. It's changing some bits of COM-B, right? I'm increasing people's capability or opportunity or motivation. But the things that I've focused on are not the reasons that people are doing this behavior. So if you have measurement around that, it helps you sort of iteratively improve. Melissa, any additions there that you want to add to evaluation?
Sorry, I was reading the questions and not listening to you. Looking for the next one.
I would say mainly if your intervention isn't giving you the results that you've expected, it's because you've either focused on perhaps the slightly inaccurate barriers, like you just need to revisit your diagnosis, or you haven't quite nailed the behavior, the link between the behavior and the barriers. And so it's an invitation to revisit these two stages. And that's baked into this process, is there's a backwards revisit and redefine.
And just on that too, something we didn't mention earlier was behaviors quite often happen in a chain. So they happen in a series. It's not just one single behavior. It's behavior A leads to behavior B leads to behavior C. And when we're trying to come up with an intervention, we generally focus on what we call the end state behavior. What's the one that has the ultimate impact on the problem? But quite often, if we try to focus too far up the chain, we might be changing a behavior up here, but ultimately that's not having an influence on the problem because there's still a sequence of behaviors that need to happen after that. And so sometimes it's about going back and reevaluating that.
Next question is there a workbook available to work through these issues as in using this framework? We do, but I need to ask we might come back to you, Daniel, on that if that's okay. We just need to check in with Madeline about this from Melbourne Water. The next question is a whopper. What do you see as the biggest barrier in climate change action, Melissa?
Climate change is what we refer to as a wicked problem. It's an incredibly complex problem that is not one solution. It's many, many hundreds of thousands of solutions. So the biggest barrier in climate action for me personally is humans. But I think that's a bit too simplistic. It depends on the audience, the issue, the context. Yeah, many, many different behaviors, many, many different actions.
Yeah, you want to try and narrow in on individual behaviors rather than the problem, because it's hard to come up with barriers to a problem. You want to try and come up with barriers to specific sub actions.
Mm.
Sue's got a great question. What are some methods, and this, Melissa, is your wheelhouse. What are some methods you use to find out the knowledge or attitudes of your target audience?
So most commonly, we will use methods like surveys or interviews, depending on how accessible a person is, how many people we're trying to tap into. But you can find a lot about people's attitudes by setting up survey questions to frame it in such a way just to sort of say, what do you feel about this and how do you think about that? Equally, interviews or focus groups is also a really good way to gather that information if you're trying to get a more kind of nuanced understanding of what that specific attitude or knowledge is. They're probably the two main ones.
Next question is a good one, Jen. Any suggestions to encourage cat owners to keep cats inside? It's actually a really good, not like a good problem, but it's a good topic. And this was actually addressed by Zoos Victoria. And I think it was a BehaviourWorks project as well. I think we were involved in it. But basically, like a bunch of,
safe cats, safe wildlife.
Have I been annotating my slide? It's like a bunch of yellow marks all over it. Apologies, everyone, if that's me. But yeah, safe cats, safe wildlife. It's a really good intervention if you want to go and have a look at it. And essentially what it is they did this deep dive process of trying to figure out the drivers and barriers. And they found that the most influential thing was that keeping cats indoors was more likely to increase the cat's lifespan, and that was one of the most influential motivators for cat owners to do the behavior. So there's a really good intervention on it. Have a look. The Zoos Vic, Safe Cat, Safe Wildlife. How do we change the attitudes of loggers in a remote regional area with special waterways and beautiful rainforests? Prue, I don't know if I can answer that one for you, unfortunately, because I don't know if I understand the attitudes of loggers. Melissa?
Yeah, I would say the same. Attitude in what sense? So attitude to wanting to log, to not wanting to log, to logging how many, sort of depends on what the specific attitude is. I mean, persuasive campaigns are often useful in that sense, but again, it depends on what the kind of, what's the context in which the attitude is happening within.
So you want to try and go through the process that we outlined of first, like gathering the information on their attitudes. And then once you know what attitudes that these loggers have, then you can go through that same process of looking at all your options. So attitudes always sit under reflective motivation. And so to change attitudes, you can educate these loggers, you can persuade them, you can incentivize them, or you can coerce them. Those are your four main options to change attitudes. Sometimes attitudes are also informed, like they're the second thing, and they're informed by people's emotions or by people's knowledge. And so if the primary driver of the attitude is an emotion, you'd look at automatic motivation here. Slightly different question. How effective is multiple exposure? E.g., if I want people to join our friends group, do they need to hear about it a number of times before they actually get around to coming? Oh, good question, Robin.
That is a good question.
It depends on the audience and the behavior that you're asking them to do. So in a very different context, we're doing some work with the City of Monash at the moment to see like how many rounds of exposure do householders need before they change their recycling habits to reduce contamination. I would say that like you wouldn't really know until you actually measured it, like until you measured how many times they get exposed to the comms about your friends group before they join. I don't know if I have any data off the top of my head on that. Melissa, do you?
Not off the top of my head. The thing that's coming to mind though is social influencers are often very relevant in that kind of a context. So if other people are doing it, you're more likely to join if your friends are there, for example. How that ties into multiple exposures, I'm not sure. I can't think of any literature off the top of my head.
I've got a couple of just like general comments from Colin. Great way of looking at the problem or issue. I've got a couple of projects upcoming. Getting the community buy-in, like the sticky idea and scratching the itch, perhaps. Yeah, community buy-in is really important, and it tends to sit somewhere around like social opportunity, reflective motivation, the sort of attitudes and what other people are doing. So hopefully, having a look at the options here for how you can use some social leverage and change some attitudes might be really nice. Um, got a couple of ideas in there about cats. Ba, 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 ba. Systems thinking. Any resources, we will try and get you some resources to help with implementing this. Hillary, we've got a practical question. Searching for an injured duck in an on-lead wetland. Politely informed a man with 2 kelpies that it was on lead and I was a rescuer. Was told to get out of his face. Another person told me to F off. Signs everywhere. Other visitors kept silent. Parks Vic don't have staff to monitor. Dog areas 300 meters away. Any suggestions, please? Attitudinal issue won't be told. Oof, that's a rough one. I deeply empathize, Hillary. That's tough. It sounds like this may be slightly beyond the scope of a individual level intervention. You might need to be sitting in this restriction coercion space. That's something I'm thinking. Melissa, any different ideas?
The thing immediately comes to mind is the automatic motivation, so the habits. If this is a habitual behavior that's done kind of below conscious awareness, habits are incredibly difficult to change. And particularly, we often see kind of reflective motivation and automatic motivation come hand in hand. So I've never done this, and I also don't think it's an important thing to do. And the two can kind of, mutually reinforce each other. Really, really tricky. What you talk about too in terms of resources in order to provide that kind of monitoring from Parks Vic, that's an absolutely system level problem as well that will feed into it. So suggestions, a tricky one.
It's a really tricky one.
Yeah.
Happy to reflect on this and try and get back to you on it if we can. Judith has a really good question. I've got probably time for, I'm thinking like another 2 or 3 questions and then we'll do wrap up. When do you assess the segmentation factor? Is it when you decide your audience? I would say yes. But sometimes we get started into diagnosis and we realize that our audience is a little bit more varied than we'd originally thought. And then we have to revisit. And that's really normal in behavioral science. You like take a few steps forward and sometimes you got to go a step back. But usually you decide it at the very beginning when you're deciding on your audience, like here. But if that's not possible and you've thought you've got an audience and you've moved all the way forward before you realize actually there's multiple segments and I need to tease them out a bit more, it is okay to go backwards and change your audience and your behavior.
Suggestions to encourage cat owners to keep cats inside. One of the most effective things I've seen is there's been studies where they've actually put like a webcam or like a cam on the cat. Most cat owners think that their cat doesn't go beyond their property, and it's not until they actually see the evidence of the cat going elsewhere and often many kilometers away that they go, oh, wow, I never knew. So that kind of evidence idea can actually be really helpful. Keeping the cats inside one is the Safe Cat Safe Wildlife. The research that they did, as Kavya said earlier, was probably the most useful in that sense. Play that kind of persuasive, your cat will be safer, it won't get exposed, you won't have to pay as much at the vet. Won't get into cat fights, that kind of thing.
I'm conscious of time, and so I might move us into summary and wrap up. But if you do have some like really burning questions, Madeline does have our details if needed. But to bring all of this very intensive learning to a close, the 4 steps that you really want to try and remember, and you want to work through them in this order, is what is my problem and whose behavior needs to change? Who do I want to focus on? And so sometimes you've got a big audience, sometimes you've got a little segment, but that who is really important. And it might be who has the power to actually change the problem. It might be who is receptive to changing their behavior and who you have access to. There's different reasons for picking an audience, but this is always where we start. What's our problem? Whose behavior needs to change? Then we ask, what behavior do they need to do differently? And we'll often have a long list of different behaviors that people could be doing. There's lots and lots of options. And if we can, we want to try and use something like the impact likelihood matrix to really narrow and prioritize in. Once we've got our one singular behavior, we move into diagnosing our drivers and our barriers. What drives this behavior? What do people find easy about this? And what do people find hard? And then using that information, how can we design a solution? And so a couple of recap visuals. I'm a visual learner. Hopefully some of you are as well. We want to think about who does what to what, where, and when, right? So who's our audience? What are they doing? What are they doing it to, and when and where is it happening? We want to think about the impact likelihood matrix, those 4 squares. Vertical is impact, sideways is likelihood. We want to think about the things that influence behavior. COM-B is really nice. Are people capable? Do they have an opportunity to do it? And are they sufficiently motivated to do it? 3 very simple questions you can ask yourself to try and unpack why people are doing the unideal behaviors that they are. What are they? Do they have enough capability? Do they have the chance to do it? And are they motivated? And then lastly, there's 9 ways that you can intervene at an individual level. So not at a systems level, at an individual level. You can educate, persuade, incentivize, model, train, enable, restructure the environment, coerce, or restrict. And these are different ways that we can make change happen. On behalf of myself and Melissa, a really, really big thank you. It's so lovely to have you all spend 90 minutes with us and get to hear all about your interesting challenges. And thank you for being so participatory. It would be really helpful for us if you could do, it's like a, Melissa, what, like a 3 minutes?
3 minutes. I think it's like 6 questions. Won't take you very long at all.
Very short little survey. Be really helpful if you could give us some feedback. And our details are there. Please do reach out if you need anything. And all the best with your behavior change interventions. I hope that they are more effective and more creative and that they work really well. But thank you so much for all of your time.
Everyone.
Yes, good question. Can we put the survey link in the chat? Yes, I can. Just give me one moment.